All right, finally, we're back. We're 10 minutes late because of our connection to the internet. It's very interesting in here. So what we're talking about today is we're going to continue stuff that we've been talking about in JavaScript today. Of course, our course is COMP125, client-side web development at Centennial, the summer 2016 semester, and it's week 10, part 3. Okay, so we've done that piece, and someone has sent me Slack messages. Let us continue with what we did before. So I'm pulling up Visual Studio Code. Remember, the Visual Studio Code still, in this distribution, has a bit of an issue with drag and drop. It actually doesn't even remember what you last were using. So that's okay. They're going to fix that on the back end. I've looked at some nightly distributions, and it looks like they're okay. So I'm going to kind of grab. If I grabbed this normally and dragged it, there's no problem. It would work. Now it's not going to work. I'm going to have to go open folder. And I'm going to have to hit lesson 10 and click open. OK, we're going to go to this in a second. So we've done a couple things, but I want to put this up on Azure. And I've added a line in here. We have a web.config file. And by the way, I have this file all open up. This is from last day. It's all open up on GitHub. You can see it. I have to have a web.config file for Azure if you're using Azure. If you're using the school server, no problem, right? But if you're using Azure, because it's a cloud service, they limit the type of MIME types you can access, right? And one of the things they limit is JSON. From a security perspective, you have to put this line of code right here inside your web.config file. It's simply just for Azure in order for your JSON data to work. If you don't do this, your assignment number 3, which I'm going to give you in a second, will fail on Azure, all right, 100%. All right, so please, you need to have this line on line 12, right? This MIME map file extension .json, if you're going to use a JSON file, MIME type application JSON. This line here in your web.config file, along with the stuff that you need for your so that Font Awesome will also work. This is all the stuff for Font Awesome, and this web.config file we've been having in our distribution for our GitHub file over the last few lessons, right? So it's not just now. We've always had this web.config file just sitting around. You okay? Drink much? Okay, let's go back. So we're talking about what we did last day, but let's go into that assignment that I want to give you guys. So if you look at up online, up on Dropbox, again, everything we do is electronic, right? So there is no paper document. If you go to assignment 3 on Dropbox, it looks like this. So what we're doing is we're taking your mini portfolio site that you already have, right, from assignment 1, right? And we've already updated assignment 2. There was an update to the mini portfolio site. And for assignment 3, you're updating it again because we're using this mini portfolio site as just a vehicle for us to learn, right? That's what it's for. And also, to give you a little bit of experience building something, right? This thing is due week 12. It's worth 15% of your final mark. So it's a little bit higher in marks. As we go, it's going to be a little bit higher. And the reason why it's worth 15 is because there's some complexity around making this work. So, to try and make it work, to try and figure out how to do stuff, it might take you a few hours to do. That's why I've given you 2 weeks. So this will be due week 12, Friday, August 5th, 2016 at midnight, right? So a couple weeks from now. And what you'll be doing with this one is you're going to extend your mini portfolio site from assignment 1 and 2, and you will write JavaScript code to read your paragraph data from a JSON file using Ajax, the stuff we talked about. By the way, if you wanted to, right now we've been talking about using Ajax with JavaScript. Next week we're going to talk about Jquery, right? So that's one thing we're going to talk about next week. And if you choose to use Jquery instead of just regular Ajax with JavaScript, I'm okay with that too. Right? You don't have to use just pure JavaScript. You can use Jquery, which we're going to talk about next week, because you're going to have other tools to do the same thing. So you're going to read it and then populate your page with the data. So same data you have right now. I'm not asking you to make new stuff. Just take the exact same paragraph data, right? And then instead of putting it in hard coding it into strings inside of your arrays, however you did it, inside of your document, your HTML documents, take this data, format a JSON file with the data properly, right? And then read from the JSON file and populate your website with the stuff. Very simple. Again, the population technique that we're going to use, I'm going to ask you to store everything in an array, which is a little different. If you didn't do it in an array already, it's going to change some of the code on the back end, of how you store your data. Before, you might have been storing it in just simple strings, right? Now I'm asking you to put it into array because we just finished talking about array and strings. So it'll give you an opportunity to work with those structures as well. So again, ensure that you use the appropriate data structure. That would be arrays, right? To contain your data, and the appropriate looping structure, probably a for each, right? To loop through all the data and pump it out to the web pages that you need to, according to which page you're on, okay? One of the questions I always get is, okay, what if I have paragraph data, right? But it's going to be different for every page, right? So for example, I'm on my main page, and I might have some paragraph stuff that I want to put, or some content that I want to populate my main page with. Okay, fine. And the content that you're going to populate on your main page, it comes from the file. But it also comes from the file on your bio page. And it also comes from the file on your contact page. And it also comes from the file in other places. How do you do that? How do you separate those things? Well, there's a couple of solutions. One, I could use multiple files. I could use multiple JSON files. And every time you're on a different page, you just read different JSON files. So I would allow that, right? If you can't manage one file for whatever reason. If it makes it simpler for you to use multiple files, multiple JSON files. So let's say, for example, page 1 address, paragraphs on one file, right? And then page 2 paragraphs on another file, or whatever. You can do that. I'm okay with that. The right way to do it is to use one JSON file, and everything's in there. And then, depending on the page, you sort through the data file on your own, right? You know, using the objects, parse everything when it comes in, right? So you convert it from string to JSON, right? So to data. And then after you do that, you push everything out by connecting and by making a reference, whether you're using get element by ID, get elements by tag name, get elements by whatever. You can also use query selector all, whatever methodology you want to pump it out to your web page. All right. So far all we've dealt with is data. Why? Because the majority of what we do with JavaScript, there's two things actually. One is data handling, like this, calculations, which is dumb easy, right? Just again, you're just going to get the data from your form. Let's say if I want to do calculations, and then add two things together by converting them to numbers, and then kind of doing some calculations and putting them back out as strings. That's one option. And the other third thing we haven't touched on is some kind of special effects, animations, advertising with some kind of game, that kind of thing. We do with JavaScript too. We're going to handle that in the next assignment. The next assignment, I'm going to get you to learn a whole brand new API, right? We're going to start doing some of the pre-work today to get us there, because it's going to take a little bit of setup for us to get there, right? And then once we do all that stuff for the next assignment, you'll be able to make, and I'll just tell you what the next assignment is. I'm not going to populate it yet, but you're going to make a banner ad, right, on your mini portfolio site, right, with pure JavaScript. Okay, that's what your job is going to be, right? Okay, so that's just telling you what's coming, right? So how do I do that banner ad? That means like you're going to have animations, there's going to be movement, something's going to happen there. Also, other things we do is a carousel. If sometimes I ask you to do a carousel, that's very common. Although carousels are quickly becoming, I'm going to say, less and less popular because it's the same effect. Some kind of moving carousel, it's actually less and less popular as opposed to a continuously scrolling or some kind of parallax scrolling background with big video. That's still really popular. Now that's a different topic. It's not a topic of JavaScript. It's a topic of a design course. Like if I was going to take a design course and show you different ways of designing a UI UX kind of thing, that kind of course we would talk about those things. But in this case, we're talking about pure JavaScript, and that's why this assignment focuses on how do I get data from a file, like from Ajax as an example. By the way, the same methodologies you're going to use here, you can also use when it comes connecting to a database, and we'll talk about that. All right, so again, so that one part is, if you look at the different instructions here, the first part is, hey, create a JavaScript function that uses Ajax to read JSON file that contains all your paragraph data, right? 4 marks. And then the data that is retrieved from the JSON file, and I'm just calling it paragraphs.json example, right, should be stored in an array data structure. That's new. I didn't force you to do a structure. I said just make it work last time. Now I'm forcing you to do an array, right? So if you don't use an array, you lose 4 marks, right? Populate pages of your mini portfolio site with this data and ensure that you use the appropriate looping structure. The array for each would be a good looping structure, right? You could also use a for loop or a while loop. I'm not going to force you to use a for each, but make sure that it loops properly. And we'll talk about how I can use the for each today to kind of distribute my data, right? That's it, really. From a functionality perspective, that's all I want you to do. It's not that difficult functionally. Again, I want you to maintain the file structure we've been using so far. You will have to create a paragraphs.json file. You will have to do that. I'm not going to supply that for you. Your paragraphs.json or whatever the JSON file is going to be, you're going to put it inside your scripts folder, just like I've shown you, right? And that paragraphs.json file needs to be formatted for JSON data. And we're going to talk about more about JSON format today, how to format your files with JSON, right? Again, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. That's what it is. But they're not JavaScript objects. They're not. It's just a notation we use, and we use it for things like databases like MongoDB. MongoDB is a very popular database these days, especially when we use the full stack. If you're a mean stack developer, so Mongo, Express, Angular, Node, MongoDB or a flavor of MongoDB, like our example would be Firebase, right? CouchDB, another flavor. DocumentDB, Microsoft's flavor, right? They're all Mongo-like, so they all use JSON data for their database. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. Then after you've created your paragraphs.json file, you're going to, I want you to include a web.config file for sure. I've given you 2 marks for it, even though I've already given it to you, right? Only because if you forget to do this, you will not be able to deploy to Azure. So that's why I'm telling you to use it. Make sure you have this structure. And it's important to have this structure in your files, right? Internal documentation, 6 marks. We've talked about this before. Files like GitHub and Azure. So that's 8 more marks for a total of 38. Now, it's 15% for 38 marks. That's not a lot of points for 15%. So I'm going to be very specific about your functionality and your UI, and all these other things are going to have a little bit more weight for this one than they would in other assignments. Just be careful, right? So not a lot of points I'm looking at right now, but those points are really, really important. Okay. Any questions around what you're building for assignment 3? Timeline-wise, you got 2 weeks, right? It's an individual assignment. It's not something you partner with because it's for your portfolio site. You're just expanding or extending your portfolio site. I do want a separate GitHub repository. Please don't use assignment 1 and 2 and extend that. Make it another repository. And you know, there is no external documentation for this one. It's just internal, which is really good. So save you some time. And again, you have to pop it out on Azure or the school server is fine. Okay. One thing to note about Azure is it fills up. Okay, I gotta remind you about this. So please, if you have a lot of stuff that you've been doing, like if you're following along and doing your lessons and all that stuff with me on Azure and you're putting it up and testing it, that's nice. But I would recommend that you delete anything on Azure you don't need, right? So that way the deployments will work properly. Otherwise, the deployments may fail. And it's not because of anything else. You just don't have an unlimited amount. Okay. So any other questions around assignment 3? All right. So this one's all around assignment 3. I want you to talk about it a little bit. If you have a question, please bring it up before the end of class. Okay. Let's take a look at what we have so far. So I want to help you build assignment 3. So far, I've kind of helped you build it already. You've already got an addressbook.json file. Let's take a look at the JSON format a little bit more closely. And we're also want to go through some more examples, right? As an example, because I don't just have I can do other things with Ajax. I don't have to just load JSON. I can load XML. I can load HTML, right? Which is really cool. Right? So how do I load HTML with JSON? We're going to talk about that in a second. So I have this JSON file, and notice that I have an array. This is the array name, and a little bit differently formatted. One thing is you need these external curly braces that basically tells this file that this is JSON. Okay, that's one. One thing to note is that there are some really cool resources, and let's see if I can bring it up. Some really cool resources here for JSON, right? And I want to see if I might have some resources here to show you. I do. I recommend there is a JSON editor online. So if I go to this link here, where it says JSON editor online, here's an example of some paragraphs. I wanted to show you this so that you can see I've already pre-done this, right? The JSON editor online, you can create a paragraphs. I'm trying to help you for assignment 3, by the way. A paragraphs array, right? And notice that in the paragraphs array, you have several paragraphs that are chunked in here. There it is. There's your paragraph data. And on the right, it shows you what it's structured like. This is element 0, element 1, element 2, and 3. If whatever you put here is improper, it'll give you the error. It'll show you the error. Yes. This is the JSON file. I've put some paragraph data. You structure it the way you like, right? I'm just showing you that this is just an array of paragraphs. So why am I telling you to load it in an array? Because if you structure your JSON data file like this, then it makes sense to structure your function so to use arrays as well. That's why. Do you have to? No. You can store them in strings if you really want to, but you're going to lose 4 marks. Okay, so this is what it does. So this is a great tool. It's called, again, JSONEditorOnline.org, right? It's a good link to use for running with JSON, understanding JSON data, right? There are other ones that are really cool. Let's look at JSON Lint, right? This is a JSON validator. So what I can do is I can drop a JSON file in here, right? And it'll validate if it's proper JSON. That's another way to do it. So JSONLint.com, right, is also another little resource we can use. So let's say, for example, I take this whole file. I can copy it, just the file, what it looks like, and then paste it in here. And then it'll tell me if it's JSON, and it'll say valid JSON. But if, for example, I miss some kind of closing brace or something, and I click validate JSON, it'll say, I'm sorry, but you're missing a closing brace. So it'll give you some details of where the problems are, right? Further than that, I mean, you can definitely use stuff that's online, right? But I also recommend that, or explain to you, if I take one of these braces away from my file, right, and save my file, is it going to error out? Right now, it will not, right? So, I mean, it's not going to tell me that there's an error with the file. If I go back and forth to JSON, as an example, it's not going to say anything. We're golden, right? So this is why it's a good idea to validate your JSON data before you try and load it. Because sometimes what happens is you make a file, and you're like, I did everything that Tom said that I was supposed to do. I used the exact script that Tom gave me. I followed steps 1, 2, 3, 4. Still, I'm getting an error. Why? And probably because your JSON file is wrong. That's why. Your JSON file has to be formatted correctly. And there's different things to do here. Here's another link I want to share with you, right? Not this one. The other link I want to share, and did I kill it? I may have. I don't know why I did that. But the other link I'd like to share with you is JSON itself. If you actually go to JSON.org, it actually tells you how everything should be formatted. So I think, I can go into detail. Remember, JSON is just a data distribution format, okay? So if I'm gonna, and it's the most popular format. That's why I'm not concentrating on XML, because XML was the older format that's still there, but JSON is quickly becoming the most important format out there, right? And it really gives you a structure of how your JSON data should look, right? Okay, so if you wanted to understand what JSON looks like, it goes into a lot of detail here about how to put things together, right? One thing to note is that I want you to think of your JSON data in terms of each file, right? I might have a JSON file, but each file itself could be considered a collection or a database, all right? So let me take a look at this for a second. Let me go back to my file. So this, from here to here, is my database, right? I want you to think about this as a database. Then I have an array, right? This array, this context property, right, is part of my document, okay, my document. If we think about it like this, the document itself, or this thing here, right here, is the table in my array, right? My table in my database. And each of these items inside of my database could be considered a record, right? So I have a name, an email, name and email, name and email, and so on. I could add additional data here to make it more database-like. For example, I could add an ID field. So notice that it's giving me an error now, right? I could add an ID where I have a value of 1, as an example, right? So my value of 1, I need to put commas to make sure that a comma separate all of my fields. These are all my fields, right? And I'm just going to take this thing right here, and I can repopulate this thing, just giving you an example, right? Just so that way it looks nice. Repopulate this thing so that it doesn't have just an ID. Now, the ID is not auto-generated. We have to generate it ourselves. We can also Sometimes what happens is you might want to put, start with 0 if you really want to mirror it, right? Doesn't matter to me how you put your ID if you're going to do this, right? But you could do something like this, where you have ID number 3 for the user. The user has an ID, right? And number 4. And there it is. So 0, 1, 2, 3. All I've done is added another property to each object. Each object represents a user or some kind of contact, right? So again, this is a data exchange format, right? It's not an object. It's not JavaScript. This is just data. That's all I want you to think of it as. So JSON is just JSON data, right? Okay, good. So now that I've done that, if I go to my app.js, right, and we want to look at what we were doing last day, because it's important for us to understand where we were before we know where we're going with this example. If I go here, you can see that I have a step 1 would be just to review an XHR object. XHR, again, I made it in the global space here, the functional space. Why? So I could use it in another function over here, right? If I was doing everything in one function, I could, kind of say var XHR is equal to this XML HTTP request. Now this works for modern browsers, right? And if I was to go to Ajax, if I looked up Ajax, and I've got to go back to this because we use W3 Schools a lot for reference, as well as Stack Overflow and a lot of online resources. So if I go Ajax, right, as an example, and if I go to Ajax, so JavaScript Ajax, so here's Ajax tutorial. Oops, I had it for a second. Ajax. By the way, one thing that you may also find is that, here it is. Ajax is also, it used to be called, or it used to be thought about as asynchronous JavaScript and XML, right? Please don't call it that, because it's not just for XML. Just call it Ajax. In the modern web, we don't call it asynchronous JavaScript and XML, because it may not be asynchronous, number 1. Could be synchronous if you want to, right? And the other reason is we're not using XML. A lot of times we use JSON, right? Or HTML or something else, right? So here's one thing. So if you look at the tutorial they have, if you want to learn more about Ajax, there's actually exactly the same examples here in one blow. You can see that they have an example, right? And they talk about the XML HTTP request. So you could follow this, and if you really wanted to follow up and understand what we're doing. Also, they talk in detail about how to make the request response system, just exactly how we have already up online, right? And here's something that I want to go to, this third page. Notice that we have a variable. Our variable is this new XML HTTP request. That works on most modern browsers. However, if you're using something like IE5 and IE6, I told you I'm not going to care about those things, right? Because we don't care about that. That's going way far back now. However, if you really wanted to support it and you're working for some kind of government agency or an enterprise or something that still uses IE5 and IE6 in some of their older computers, because they've grandfathered those computers in, they're waiting for those computers to die so they can get the most value for their money, the return on their investment. That's what happens, truly. They might have a machine out there that runs Windows XP or something older, right? Then they might have something like IE5 and IE6 if they haven't maintained them. And if so, we can't use XML HTTP requests. We need to use ActiveX object, right? Which is an older way of doing it, right? So they give an example here online, as well as in other places, how to use an ActiveX object instead of an XML HTTP request if you're using older browsers. I need to mention this only because it would be remiss of me not to do it and say, Tom never said how to do older stuff. This is how you would do it, right? We won't do that here in this course, but it's there for you so you know that it exists, right? As long as you know that it exists, sometimes we can find solutions, right? This is organized very nicely, and it talks about things like Ajax request, right? So it talks about how to make an Ajax request. It breaks down everything. Then we get a response. So this is like step 1, 2, 3, pretty much, right? How to pump it out to your site with using document.getElementById. We saw that as an example, and it gives you examples here. How to use Ajax events. Again, the idea of ready state, we talked about that last time, as well as status code 200. We need to, again, we're listening for a ready state of 4, which is everything's finished loading and that everything is okay. We need those two things to check to make sure that everything's ready before we use the data, right? Talks about how to combine Ajax with PHP, which is cool. Ajax with old ASP, examples here as well. Ajax with some other kind of database, right? So it gives you how to do Ajax with a database, pure JavaScript form, right? How to do it, and how to use things like GET requests and things like this is using PHP again because you see this percent, and also things like not just ASP, but by database. One thing they don't talk about too much is how to combine it with other technologies like HTTP. So if I go Ajax XML, right, how to do an XML example, so load an XML document, right, which is a little different than when we load JSON, right, how we load XML, and we parse the XML, right, because now it's response.xml is what we're going to get, right, where XML itself is just a variable that we're using, right, so XML.response.xml, right, where, again, what I want to do is I can read XML instead of reading things like your, as an example, JSON data, right? And they have lots and lots of examples, right? Here's some examples of a simple Ajax example, loading an XML file, retrieving header information from with Ajax, and so on. Lots of stuff that's online that you can, and so I recommend using this resource as a backup if you can't, you can't do it on your own, or if I haven't given you enough information. All right. So what if I want to use Ajax? If I want to type this in, Ajax, to load, right, HTML. Can I do that too? Right? Because I can use Ajax to do that. Well, we're going to do that in the next section. So when we hit Jquery, right? Jquery is great. Cut language. We're going to hit that next week, and it's going to help us use Ajax in a lot, some really cool ways. And one of the ways it does it is because it has other functionality to take care of some of the complexity around loading things like HTML and so on. So we're not going to handle that this week. But I want you to know that it's possible. And we can use Ajax to break up our site. Remember we had these problems where I have my header, my navbar, and I have to keep on repeating my navbar. Every page has to have a navbar, 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 navbar. And then what if I make a change on one page? I got to make changes to every single other page. And so from a maintainability perspective, it's really dumb. All right, like that would be really dumb for me to have to change all these pages. I need some kind of, view engine, right, was what we call them nowadays, or a way of dynamically loading our HTML and combining HTML in one page. So I have my header, my footer, and my content in separate partial files that I combine to render my full page. Yeah. Well, it is using layouts, but we can't. There's no layouts for JavaScript, right? There's no layouts for HTML, right? It's just HTML and JavaScript and CSS, right? But what I'm doing is, you can't create partial files without using some kind of JavaScript library. So when I say partial files, think about me breaking up my without using something like a PHP or something like that. PHP you can do it. You can use includes, right, to kind of include different data everywhere else. We're not doing that with this. Here there is no includes. You can't include partial files, partial HTML files. You can't do that with this. You need to use, the other way to do is to use Ajax or some kind of front-end framework like AngularJS, right? Or React, or something like that. Can't get into React or Angular. That's a whole course of its own, right? We were just do React and Angular, right? But we can talk about how to use Ajax to load different parts of the page, right? Right. That's what we can do. But we're going to talk about this next week. Okay. So just giving you a little bit of thing of how do I load HTML with Ajax. Can I do it with just JavaScript? So if I said just JavaScript, yes, you can. Anything you can do with Jquery, you can do with JavaScript too. But I'll tell you right now, it's much more difficult to load another HTML file. If I click on this one, it gives you the example of how to do it, right? So I make a load page file. I still make an XML HTTP request. I use the get. This time it says there's something called href, which we're going to pass into this function, right? Which is the HTML document. I'm going to use a send request, and then I'm going to return the response text. So it seems very similar. Now look at all this text. We could do this in one line with Jquery. Like literally, one line. Now it says, look, on click, right, then get the data, and then put this hello world. This is I'm going to load page. This inner HTML is the load page, which is this function, which is going to return this XML HTTP request. right, to the get element by ID in the bottom. So if we want to try it, let's try it now. Let's separate our navbar, right? I'm take my navbar away, and I'm going to separate it into a separate HTML file. In fact, the header, we'll call it header, right? So the whole header information, instead of doing our CSS and everything else and blah, 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 we'll take that information and we'll put it into a separate file, and then we'll do it again with jQuery next week, and you'll see how beautiful and how easy it is to do. Much easier, right? All right, so let's prepare. So the first thing we need to do is when we do this kind of stuff, we have to look at a page. So here's my index.html, right? Index.html, I mean, this all is the same. Every single page we do, all of this is exactly the same. We have a problem, though. I have to say, we have a problem with the active link. That active link, we have to detect what the active link is, because that's going to change. We can't, this can't be, the index.html, it's hard-coded. My class active, to indicate which link I'm on, right, is hard-coded in each of my pages. In my index, in my contact has my active link here, and in my about page, right, my about page has my contact link in a different place, right, and so on, right? Yeah, just a little bit differently arranged, but more or less is the same stuff. So I have, there's my about page has its active link here. So I have it different places, and I don't want to do that. I want to create my own header page, and I also, furthermore, I want to split up my header page, right, as an example, into another folder, right? So I might have my index.html because I need an index.html to come into. That's one thing I need. But my index.html is going to use JavaScript, right, to combine my navbar in one place and my footer from the files, right? So let's create a partials folder, right? We can create a partials folder here. So here's partials, and it's got to be on the root, so it can't be here. It's got to be on the root somewhere, right? Here's the partials folder right here, and you know what? It's not really. I mean, if I want to follow the convention, let's make this. Let's just rename this with a capital, just to make it so the same as everything else. Again, this is just a fix. One thing we want to do is make a new file, new HTML file, which we're going to call header.html, header.html, right? And we're also, just to follow up with this, let's make another file that we're going to call footer.html. So we have our header and our footer, all right? In our header, we want to put in all the head information, right, for the page, okay? But be careful, because if I include my header information in the page, and if I don't have header information, can I, I'm just putting it out there, can I slap together stuff? We're going to talk about this. How much of my header can I include, or should I call this navbar? And because I don't have full control. We're going to try both ways. Let's instead of calling it header, let's take a step back. Sorry. Let's take a step back and call this navbar, just our navbar.html for a second. Okay, just putting it out there, right? So if I put my navbar, and here's my footer, in my navbar alone, let's see if I can just change that. So let's just grab my navbar. So from this point on, here's my navbar, and where it says on the bottom. So from line, if I'm looking at my index.html file, I'm looking at my lesson 10. If you're following along, I'm grabbing line 17, and I'm going down to line 42, and I'm cutting it out. Woof, no more navbar, right? And I'm populating right now in my navbar.html. So let's put that in there. Poof. There's my navbar.html. Notice it's just a partial file. It does not include doc type and all that stuff you need, right? Cool. But what it does do is give me this thing. And what I want to do is, instead of my list item, my first list item has active is my index.html. Let's take that away, because I want to use JavaScript to change this. We've done this before, right? So that the active list item, right, is going to be changed according to which page I'm on. Okay? All right, cool. So we've done this thing right now. We've got to my index.html. Notice I've removed my navbar, so my navbar is gone, right? And what I want to do is create a section where my navbar is going to go. You have to tell it where to go, because we have to link into it somehow. So let's use a div tag. Yeah? Yes, you could do that. So let's say, for example, I'm going to use some kind of header tag. Here's my header. And inside my header, what I want to do is give it an ID, right? So my ID would be main nav or something like that. And let's make sure that it doesn't clash with anything else I have in here. So did I call this main nav? No, thank God. right? But let's say, for example, if I go back into my header, so my index.html, I have a header with an ID, right, of main nav. This is where my main nav is going to go. You don't have to use a header. You can use a div tag, section tag, whatever, right? It's more semantic to say it's header because that's where it's the header tag of my document. All right, cool. So what I want to do is, in my main nav, I want to use Ajax, right, to load up my file, my navbar.html, and inject it at runtime inside this area right here. Okay, this is different than injecting JSON data. JSON data is stored inside my scripts folder, right? In my partials folder, I have my navbar.html we've filled up. Let's go back to the example that we saw online to see what it's doing. It's nothing different than what we did before. XML HTTP request, we're waiting for it to load. Do I have to wait? For example, do I have to do a, wait for the page to be ready and all this kind of stuff? The answer is yes. The other thing is, notice that in my open request here, I'm using a false parameter, which means I'm not using async. I'm using synchronous. That means I have to have this load first before everything else happens. It'll block this page from loading. I have to change this up a little bit, right? But that's something we need to do. So our load page, all the same stuff, my open, my send, everything else is here. And then what we want to do is load it up. Okay, let's go back and fix this up. Not any differently. The only difference is, by the way, I'm not saying any HTTP. The other thing is that I'm getting response text back, and I'm not going to convert it because my response text is going to be just pure text. I could make this something else. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, let's go back. So how do I do this thing? So just like we did with our in our scripts, if I go to app.js, you can see that I have in my init function, I do this. And what this does is it reads my data. Maybe what I can do is I can put this into its own method, to read my address book, right? So read my address book. So I'll do that. So I'll say something like this. I'll say function, we'll call this, read address book, right? Here it is. And my function that reads address book is going to just do all this stuff. Someone's going to take all this stuff out, copy it out, put it in there. Boop. And of course, then I'm going to be required. I'm just going to slim this down a little bit so it doesn't take as much room. Sorry. Make this all nice, and I'll color format it later on. And then what I want to do is let's just format it all now to make sure it's the same. Format the code. Yay. Okay, good. What I want to do is do the same thing, but I want to call this function first. The first thing I do is, read my address book. Right? So that's what this does. There's my read my address book in my function in it. So when a window loads, I want to read my address book. Let's think about that for a second. Is that most important, or should I load my navbar? Right? Let's do that. Let's load my navbar. So we'll make another one, another function. We'll call load navbar. Right? Okay, so there's my load my navbar. I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to copy this stuff for a second, these steps 1, 2, 3, 4, but I'm going to modify it for loading my navbar. So there's load my navbar. I still need an XML HTTP request. I'm going to use the same object. Can I do that? Sure I can, because every time I use a new keyword, right, it just reestablishes this object. Now, be very careful. It really depends on the order that you're doing things, right? Okay, number one. So this is it. I'm using a GET request. Cool. Instead of reading scripts addressbook.json, right, I'm going to read partials. So I'm looking at a different file, so partials. And it's going to go, instead of addressbook.json, it's going to say an HTML ending, right, which is going to be navbar.html. Let's use their reference and say this is false. Right, so we're not going to use asynchronous. I'm going to get rid of these steps for a second. Although these steps still apply, I'm just getting rid of them so you've already seen them. I'm not going to send anything in there, just like we did before. So we're going to get the send request. So send the request that we're going to make. First, we open the channel, then we send the request. And then, if you notice, going back to the example file, right, do they have some kind of, do they have an event listener that waits for ready state change? The answer is no. Should I? For ready state change, should I wait? Well, remember, an event listener is going to wait for the file to load before it loads the rest of the page. Might be a good idea to do it anyway. I'm not going to go to read data. It's going to read the navbar, right? So I'm going to kind of do another one that's like this one. right? So it's not, instead of reading everything at once, I'm just going to do it again. So I'm going to say another one. Let's make it separate. We're going to call this read nav, right? Nav data, right? Make it different. So there's read nav data. And I'm going to copy this start stuff here because it's going to be very similar. So I'm going to copy this and put it in here. And now I'm listening for a ready state of 4 and an XHR request of 200. If this is true, okay, now here's the data, the details. What I want to do, instead of doing all this, is I want to say var, main nav, right, is equal to document.getElementById main nav. I think I called it main nav, like this, right? That's the first thing. My main nav will make a reference. This creates a reference to the element, right? Create a reference to the HTML element, right? That's what it does. Now let's go back and make sure, just because I'm nervous, I hate making mistakes. Here's my main nav, right? Main nav. Let's make sure it's correct. All right, so we get our main nav. This is where it's coming from, right? And we've made a connection. Now we need to say that our main nav inner HTML, because we want to make it HTML, right? It's very important. Not inner text or anything else, or any other option. It's equal to XHR, right? .response text. That's what we're doing here. We're taking this stuff, the response text we're getting from the file, and we're pumping it into the inner HTML. That's it. Okay, we're done. That should do it. Now remember, we have to wait for these things. We have to see if this is right when I have false. See if it works. All right, and let's try it out. So now I'm going to launch this thing in a terminal, open terminal. Oh boy, one thing is I got to call it, right? And I want to call this one before I read my address book. So usually I want to do something like load navbar. Right? And by the way, this could be almost like a little mini constructor if you think about it. So this is my load my navbar and then read my address book, right? Load navbar should probably come first, huh? All right, let's try this out. So I'm going to go back to here, open in terminal, and I'm going to run light server. You can run your server of your choice, light-server, and let's see if this thing works. Oh man, what happened? I want to refresh, and let's see what the error is. We still get this piece. This is our content, but our navbar is not appearing. Let's see what it does. Inspect. It says the following. Synchronous XML HTTP request on the main thread is deprecated because of its detrimental effects to the end user's experience. For more help, go blah, blah, blah. Right? Notice that also I have a couple of objects. Here's my examples of the stuff from my navbar, right? Because I did these objects come through, right, as objects because of how I read my data. My data got read, but this piece I had a problem with. Let's do it asynchronous. I'm just putting it out there because I saw it and I was like, yeah. This is false? No. And this is the problems we run into when we don't use some extra library like Jquery. So if I go true, save it, go back, and if I go back to here, you can see that, well, I still don't got my files, right? It did give me an error this time. What happened? It might have read it. It says partials. Over here is scripts, right? So I said scripts relative to the to what it says. Navbar HTML is where it's looking. Let's take a look and see what we're getting. So before we do this, I need to do some console to kind of pump out what I'm getting. So I'm going to say, well, what is my XHR response text? What am I getting there? Because before, what I would do is I would take my response text and parse it, right? I don't have to do that now because it's just text, right? But let's see what happens when I do this. So I want to kind of pump out. I'm not changing it. I'm just going to say console log, just to kind of do some stuff. XHR response text. Right? I want to kind of show that to the console, and I want to kind of just to make sure that we're in there at all, right? Or maybe this never got here. It never gave us a ready state change of 4 and 200 somehow. Just putting it out there for you guys to see how this works, right? I want to say something like console log navbar red. It's done, right? So we can know that that is plus the or a navbar is equal to this text. Let's say a navbar is equal to the text. All right. Yes, nice. Let's see. Go back and see what happens. Did we get there? Let's refresh. Did we get there? That's a problem. let's check and make sure that this is not wrong now. Load navbar is reading the same data. That's bad. So this is not right. It should be reading my navbar data. So that's wrong. So read nav data. Let's see if this fixes it. Connected, but when I refresh, now it's going to the right place. Read nav data. This is this piece, right? But I never get to this line. How come? Because the data I'm trying to load, my friends, which is HTML, right, doesn't give us the same kind of response, right, that we get when we read JSON. Totally different. And the ready state and all that kind of stuff, right, we never get to a ready state of 4 and an XHR status of 200. That's one thing we have to do. So now that's the next thing is let's check to see how far we get. Did we get to this piece? Does it even do this load bar? Well, we have to. This would have had to have fired because we're still doing the address stuff here. So just to keep it simple, let's just not do the address part at all. Just the load navbar stuff and see if this is an issue. Right, now we get it. I get my navbar, and I see my navbar up here. Somehow when I do that other request, I don't get it. Why? Why is it being blocked when I do the second request? Well, there's two reasons why it's happening. Okay, and I want to point it out there to you. We talked about events before, right? And we're not doing anything wrong. Okay, I'm just telling you right now, you're being tricked. Okay, you may think, and you'd be forgiven to think, and again, we talked about this before, that when I do my event listener, right, this event listener and this event listener, you may think this happens in order, but actually it happens simultaneously. Okay, let's think about that again. It happens simultaneously. And because I'm using the same variable name, right? The variable name is, as soon as I declare this one, the same variable gets declared here, and it wipes out everything that I read from my navbar gets wiped out by my address bar automatically, even though I'm using this. Because it's asynchronous, these two functions trigger before I get my responses back from the files. And because that's happening, that's why I get nothing. And this is the biggest problem we get when we're dealing with XML or any kind of JSON data. We have to remember that any event fires or triggers simultaneously, and it's running in a separate thread. All right, that kind of idea. So we go to the thread pool, and we say, I want a thread for this event. And I go to the thread pool again, I want a thread for this other event. And now I have my main thread in the middle. And I want to run these 3 threads, the main thread and these 2 other processes, all at the same time, right? So when I run my functions, I call my functions, but these threads haven't finished yet. So they finish, but the last one resolves. This last one, address book resolves, and it changes my HTTP request to something else. So it'd be nice if we can use this same thing, but we cannot. Let's change it. So we're gonna kind of retool this thing. So I'm gonna say rename. Actually, we'll make another one first. We'll say var. And this one here is the XHR request for the nav data, and the other one would be for the address book. So XHR address book, right? That's the object for my address book, and XHR nav data, right? So there's two things here. So for the address book, we want to take this one and populate it anywhere where there's an XHR. So we can kind of do this. This is for the address book, because this is read data, right? I'll do it the long way so you can see it. So anywhere I see XHR, this request here, and this one here, it's done. So this read data is done. I'm going to skip this one for a second and go to my read Ajax book. So this one here, oops, undo. This one here has to be carried forward. All right, there it is. Okay, there it is, all good. And so my address book is taken care of. Now let's do the other one by doing it by hand for the nav data. And we'll see if there's a problem, because it'll give us a problem. So nav data, we can place it here, here, and here, right? Anywhere we see this, because that's a little differently than what we've done before, right? Here it is. And as I go forward, I also need to replace it here, 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 and here. Now we have 2 different objects. One that's handling our address book, and the other object that's handling our nav data. We're doing 2 different calls to the file system. one call for my navbar and another call for my data. All right, let's try this out. Let's see if this works now by calling both functions. Right? I get both. Right? First, I got my navbar up here, which appears up here as text. Right? It becomes an HTML, and I get all my objects down here, like I did before. Okay. All right. So I've loaded a partial file, but I don't know what page I'm on. How do I get my page? How do I get my page data? I mean, we're going to go back. How do I get my page title information? We kind of did this by title before, way back in a lesson. We kind of switched by title, right? How do we get that? Is it part of the document? Is it part of the window? What is it part of? How do I get my? Is it document? All right. So let's take a look at this. So when I get my navbar, what I want to do is my navbar is already loaded. Okay, we have to assume that my navbar is already loaded now, right? Let's just get rid of some of these console logs. So my navbar console log is working. I don't need to do this anymore. My navbar is working, right? There we go. And what I want to do is I want to change. If I go to my navbar.html, this file is going to be here, and I want to say something like this. I want to say, well, depending on which page I'm on, in my index page, my projects page, my about page, or my contact page, depending on which page it is, I want to attach an active link, an active class. So attribute class, right? And my value is going to be active. I want to attach that to the corresponding list item. That means that each list item has to have its own ID, right? So I can latch onto it. I need some way of connecting to it, right? There's several ways, but the easiest way is to create an ID for each of these. So I say ID is equal to, example, index. Right? Now we got to be careful that there's nothing else that has the same thing, right? ID is equal to projects, right? ID is equal to about. ID is equal to contact, right? So we're adding these IDs in so I can access each of these list items when I load it up. So now let's save that. When I do, I go back to my page. You know, I can see if I inspect the page. If I go right-click, inspect, and if I start inspecting the list items, so I want to inspect this one. Right here it is. I'm inspecting this one. You can see that in this one, bring it up if I can, which is my index.html. It's inside of my div tag for my navbar. Here's my navbar, right? Here's my container. My container fluid. Inside my button, there's my navbar information. Here's my I tag, right? And then down in here in my navbar collapse, I have our UL. There's my UL, and inside there's my LI, and you can see that each one of these has an index or some kind of ID, right? And this is how it accesses it. So if I want to use query selector, I could do something like this. Query selector li pound projects, just like we do for CSS. So I want to target that one. I want to, once I get that information, I want to say dot add attribute or set attribute to a class and then the value of active. That's what I want to do here. So I can switch between which one I'm on, right? Let's try this out. So that's what I want to do. I'm showing you what I want to do. And I'm doing this so that I can explain to you how I can detect which page I'm on and kind of select. Because if I select projects now, you can see projects and about. Here's my about me page, right? And here's my contact page. You can see that they have different data, right? They all use the same. They all use the same file, right? One thing that I have to do is they're not using the same navbar yet. I want to go and use the same navbar in a second. Okay, let's go back. So that's one. I'm going to take a break in a second when I do this, okay? So let's go back to my apps.js to detect that. So I'm going to say, depending on, after I've read my load navbar, maybe I want to do it in my load navbar. So my load navbar reads the data. I have my XHR nav data object, right? My nav data object, I've already pumped it out with my read nav data, my XHR nav data object, right? I've got that stuff out. And now I have a navbar, right? And what I want to do is inside my load navbar, I want to set my active page, right? So maybe it's another function. Maybe I'll put it here. So function set active page, whatever the active page is. We don't know what it is yet. And the way I'm going to detect it is I'm going to say something like this, var, right? I need to latch onto first of all, I have to use my document.title. Here's my title, my document title. Is that what I need to do to get my document title? Let's console that out. So let's set active navbar. So just to remind ourselves, console out document title. It's important, right? So here's my document title. And I want to, after I load my navbar, I want to call in order set active page before I read my data. All right, so it doesn't matter. But let's go back to here, and I'm going to go back to home, and I'm going to go to inspect, and let's see what I get in my console. Home. So this is good. So my home page, because the title of my page is home. This is what it is right here. If I go to projects, my title of my page is projects. I've got some uncaught exception errors because I don't have an inner HTML value of an object that doesn't exist yet. I will have that in a second, but it does detect its projects. And this is about me. I got to be careful what it says, about me. And the last one is contact me. Contact me. Those are my titles, right? So it does detect title, which is really, really important. That's how we're going to switch between pages again. Remember how we did this last time? So depending on what my title is, I can set my active page. Let's go back here. So my active page is, I'm going to switch. I'm going to use a switch, which is document.title. Depending on what my document.title, I'll use a switch statement with case, my first case being home, right? And I got to make sure it's correct. Home, capital H, right? Then do something. Case, if it's something else. So again, we have our about. And that was about me, if I'm not wrong. About me. Break. Case, if it's something else, like what else we have? We have our projects, right? Then do something else. Case, if we have, contact me, I think it is. That's how I made it. And then break, right? So those are all my cases. For my home page, what I want to do is I want to set the active object. So I want to say, again, I want to attach to that object, right? So I'm going to say document, we'll just do it by hands without any kind of variable this time. Document.getElementById, and we're going to search for the ID of home or index. That's the index ID. And what I want to do here is I want to say set attribute, and we'll use chaining to set the attribute of the class attribute to a value of active. That's one line. All right, so this, depending on what we're at, it'll set the if it's the home page, we'll set the index. If we take an ID with an index attribute, right? ID of index, any object with an ID of index, and set the class attribute to active, which sets that class. It kind of puts that class in place, right? And because this is the pattern we're going to use, this is a little bit repetitive, but we'll see that we can do it this way as well. We're going to go into here and then set the attribute of the page dynamically depending on which page I'm at. So instead of index, I think I did about. I think I chose projects, and I think I chose contact. That's the only thing that changes. Everything else is the same. So this is my set active page. And to test this, if I go back, and if I go back to home page, well, it didn't work. It says uncaught type error, cannot read property of set attribute of no. Okay, cannot read the property of set attribute of no. All right, because index, get element by ID index is triggering. I'm just going to put this out there to you guys. Is triggering before I have my stuff in place. It's trying to access the navbar before it's in place. So where should I put my set active page? Should it be here? No, it should be when my navbar finishes loading. When I've finished reading my navbar, then I'm going to call set active page because my navbar is now finished reading, finished loading up into my page. Now I can use this thing. Otherwise, it would not be active, right? See? 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 So now my active page shows up depending on what I'm clicking. So first, always think about everything running asynchronously, right? before we pause for a break. That means that we have to wait for everything to load before we can affect it. I was trying to affect something that hadn't loaded yet. The order in my function was correct, but none of those two things have finished loading. Until they're finished loading, can't do anything to them, and that's why it's asynchronous. All right? Let's take a small break, and when we come back, we'll do more of this stuff. We'll see if we can include not just my navbar, but also my header information in another file, and see if that works.